নমস্কার, প্রণাম, সালাম। আমি আবু আরেফ। আমি একজন বাঙালি। বাংলা আমার মাতৃভাষা। আমি বাংলাদেশে জন্মেছি। আমি একজন কোয়ার মানুষ, একজন বিচিত্র লিঙ্গ ও প্রেম ভাষার ধারক, প্রবাসী শিক্ষক, গবেষক এবং ছাত্র। I would like to begin with a formal land and labor acknowledgement. I have taken the liberty of translating this acknowledgement into my mother tongue, Bangla, to honor the language that carried me here and to recognize that our struggles, movements, and survivals are deeply interconnected. This gesture is both an offering of gratitude and a reminder that migration, knowledge making, and resistance are collective practices shaped across lands, histories, and bodies. আমরা স্বীকার করি যে মেমোরিয়াল ইউনিভার্সিটির ক্যাম্পাসগুলো যে ভূমিতে অবস্থিত তা বিভিন্ন আদিবাসী জনগোষ্ঠীর ঐতিহ্যবাহী ভূখণ্ড। আমরা গভীর শ্রদ্ধার সঙ্গে প্রদেশের বিয়থক, মিকমাহ, ইনু এবং ইনুইত জনগণের বৈচিত্র্যময় ইতিহাস ও সংস্কৃতিকে স্বীকৃতি জানাই। আমরা স্বীকার করি যে ট্রান্স আটলান্টিক দাসত্বের সহিংসতার মাধ্যমে আফ্রিকান বংশোদ্ভূত মানুষের কাছে থেকে যে শ্রম চুরি করা হয়েছে তা বিশ্বজুড়ে ইউরোপীয় সম্পদ ও অর্থনীতির ভিত্তি গড়ে তুলেছে এবং কানাডিয়ান জাতিরাষ্ট্রের ভিতরেও বিশেষ করে নিউফাউন্ডল্যান্ড ও ল্যাব্রাডরের জাহাজ নির্মাণ ও কট মাছ শিল্পে এই শোষিত শ্রম ব্যবহৃত হয়েছে। Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Abu Arif. I'm a doctoral candidate who is 3 days late in submitting literature review to my thesis supervisor and desperately wishing for another snowstorm closure while feeling tremendous guilt for asking such weather condition on everybody else. But you know the journey. And to your delight, I will be moderating today's panel. Thank you for being here in this important conversation. This session is hosted by Research with International Students, a collective of scholars committed to researching with international students rather than about them. The network centers international students' lived realities, political entanglements, and epistemic agency while critically examining the institutional and policy architectures that shape their conditions through various forms of engagement. RIS, open space for collective reflection on the everyday complexities of living and learning in an uneven, interconnected world. Today's panel is the second event in our panel session organized around the broader theme of polycrisis, a recognition that international students are navigating overlapping and compounding crises, migration governance, housing shortages, labor market exploitation, geopolitical instability, and the growing scrutinization of education. If you'd like to see our other upcoming events, so you can find the full schedule on the RIS website. This particular panel focuses on how the presence of international students is becoming increasingly politicized across host countries through visa restrictions, media narratives, national security frameworks, and public backlash. Today's panel invites us to sit with that moment and to go deeper. While we begin with Lisa and Dale, who examines how international students' mobility is being reframed as illicit or suspect through doors of entry discourse, their work traces how state actors reshape migrant legitimacy and draw higher education institutions into everyday bordering practices. Next, Jinke offers comparative analysis of the United States and Australia, showing how international students' rights are legally produced as conditional, fragile entitlements tethered to visa compliances and national security priorities. And finally, Ezgi and Tanja shifts our attention to Quebec for foregrounding international students' own voices in response to Canada's 2024 study permit cap. We will hear each presentation in turn, followed by the time for Q&A. So thank you again to our speakers and to all of you for joining us. So let's begin with Lisa and Dale.
Okay, I'm just going to set up our slideshow. Okay, almost there. Thank you for your patience. Okay, here we go. Can you see okay? Looking good? Slides? Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to Jenna and to Sylvie for all the work they've been doing with this panel season and the research with international students more generally. It's been an amazing resource. Thank you to Arif for chairing this excellent panel and the fellow panelists. Really looking forward to your talks. To position ourselves, my colleague and co-presenter Dale McCartney is a historian of higher education, while I research the intersections of migration and education. And both of us were drawn to these topics after over a decade each of professional work experience with international students. And in my case, I immigrated to Canada through an education migration pathway after studying here in Canada as an international student. So these experiences really showed us how higher education institutions have come to play migration governance roles and also engage in bordering practices in Canada. But those conversations were somewhat limited in the field of education, especially when Dale and I were both doing our PhDs. So our dissertations focused on contributing to and expanding that conversation, and we're really excited to see it explored from different angles today and continue developing this research area. So Dale and I both work in what is known as Vancouver on the west coast of Canada, but the region is also known as the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So as part of our land acknowledgement, we want to share this resource that was developed with Indigenous and non-Indigenous collaborators. It's a pedagogical effort to address misinformation and stimulate conversation regarding the intersections of settler colonialism and migration. So I've used it in my work with international students, and we thought it might be of interest to some of you on the call who are less familiar with Canada's historical and ongoing settler colonial structures. So our paper is animated by three conceptualizations, and the first is the selectivity of borders through immigration policies, which we can think of as constituting a kind of protective wall with small doors that allow for specific flows of so-called desirable immigrants. So basically, states construct these doors within a broader protective wall with the intention to facilitate particular types of managed entries. And these doors can be expanded or they can shrink, they can be opened or they can be shut through different policy adjustments, hypothetically from the perspective of the state. And then we often hear normative framings of these doors. So for example, some might be front doors, some are back doors. And usually this normative framing governs migrants' so-called misuse of these state-sanctioned doors. But it can also implicate the state in its construction and policing of such doors. So there can be a critique against the state for having a back door and thus not policing its own walls of entry sufficiently. So the fluidity of these doors really matters in multi-step immigration context, which is common in a lot of countries around the world and very common in places like Canada. And this is where migrants must hold and navigate one or more temporary resident status in a country before becoming eligible to acquire permanent residency or even compete to try to acquire permanent residency. This requires them to pass through multiple doors of entry, for example, first as a work permit holder, then as a permanent resident. But in this case, the doors are difficult to predict and locate because they can change. And international students are a unique case of multi-step immigration in countries like Canada, like Australia, where international students are increasingly positioned as desirable immigrants, in some cases ideal immigrants, to be recruited by higher education institutions on behalf of the state. So as temporary residents, students fall into this unique, almost migrant or potential immigrant space, and they're not easily characterized by imposed binaries that often describe immigrants like high skill, low skill, or temporary permanent. So to pull these kind of ideas together, we're interested in how backdoor discourses are used to narrate the legitimacy of international students as multi-step immigrants through the performance of symbolic representations of collective identities, historical narratives, and otherness. So why does this matter? First, we've seen a major shift in Canadian public opinion about immigration. So for those of you who are not as familiar with the Canadian case, from the late 1970s to the late 1990s, the majority of Canadians would say in polling that, yes, there is too much immigration. But from the early 2000s until 2023, Canada maintained a consistently positive public opinion of its immigration system, which was pretty unique across the global north. So a lot of countries look to Canada as an example of nurturing this kind of positive view of immigration. You can see from this chart that since 2023, there's been a shift. And this year happened to be a very sensitive time politically for the federal Liberal government, which was in power, because their popularity was sinking while an election was looming. So what caused the public opinion to shift? It's a little bit difficult to pin down because public opinion on immigration is driven by a range of factors like media and political discourse, political polarization, economic conditions. But we do know from the literature that the rate of immigration is also an important factor, and Canada's decreased support for immigration coincided with unprecedented population growth in 2022 and 2023 that was driven by post-COVID migration, specifically temporary migration. And importantly, the majority of this growth was driven by international students who had become a major source of economic immigrants in Canada. So no graph is apolitical, and we present this acknowledging the risk of reproducing the kind of moral panic of rapid growth about international students. You hear this a lot. But we do want to stress that it is true that the Canadian federal government intentionally developed and promoted targeted immigration pathways for international students since at least 2001, and this resulted in a sustained growth of international students, other than this dip during COVID-19 up until 2024 when a cap was introduced. And you can see that as part of the targeted immigration pathway, many international graduates were also encouraged to convert to post-graduation work permits, which is the orange line here, and this also constituted a relatively large population. And this sustained growth had several implications. One, a structural economic reliance on international student tuition as well as their labor, and two, higher education institutions played these new roles in their engagement in bordering practices, such as recruiting, sorting, and surveilling migrants on behalf of the state. And the connection between international students and permanent residency was very explicit in Canada. You can see here international students positioned as highly desirable ideal immigrants by multiple immigration ministers, inviting international students not just to study in Canada, but to stay. But it's really important to consider that the growth in the past 10 years was driven by enrollments in colleges as opposed to universities. They had traditionally enrolled local communities and charged lower tuition than universities. So some smaller schools were used more explicitly as migration gateways. And there was also a change, a growing concentration of students from India in particular, which was a shift in how international students were racialized in public and political discourse. So in 2015, for example, Indian study permit holders only comprised 14% of study permit population. By 2023, it was 41%, which is the largest concentration of students from one country in Canada. So if you recall, I mentioned 2023 was a sensitive time politically for the federal Liberal government, and that's the year that we start to see federal discourses linking temporary migrants to housing unaffordability. And in January 2024, the government announces a cap on study permit applications. And in that announcement, the then Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, Mark Miller, who you will get to know a little bit better through our presentation, stressed the need to ensure that post-secondary institutions, quote, are actually what they say they are and not fly-by-night operations and backdoor entries into Canada. So this really marked a significant reordering of international students' position within a hierarchy of migrant legitimacy and desirability. This positions students as a threat to the integrity of Canada's bordering regime, and Dale will now pick up and discuss why this reordering was important and how it came about.
Thanks, Lisa. You can go to the next slide. Sorry, Lisa's in charge of the slides, so you're going to get a lot of me sending her back and forth, probably. Okay, so as Lisa was saying, Miller, who takes charge as Minister of Immigration in the summer of 2023, changed the policy, but mobilized new rhetoric around international students. Rhetoric that we hadn't really seen before, and particularly he used this phrase "backdoor." And as Lisa was talking about, this corresponds to a discourse about legitimacy of entry that we were already sort of aware of and thinking about. But what we noticed about Miller is that his use of backdoor got picked up very, very quickly. So, for example, this is a screen cap from an interview that Miller did with Canada's national broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And you can see that the poll headline that they put on the video was that international student program is often a quote backdoor to permanent residency, which is not something he exactly said. So this term got picked up by the mainstream media very quickly and seemed to resonate in a strong way. So we were really interested in how is he using this term and what's its purpose. You can go to the next slide if you would. So to approach this question, or to sort of better understand this problem, the arrival of this term, we chose a couple complementary methods, and the two I want to talk about today, just for time purposes, are microhistory and what is the problem represented to be. So microhistory is a method that that is a historical method that focuses on a very discrete, contained phenomenon, usually what we might think of as sort of a small component of a larger process. And the purpose of microhistory is to sort of destabilize the taken for granted grand narratives that tend to operate when we talk about history. So one of the things we were really interested in is that there is a sort of received wisdom about why the government of Canada implemented international student caps. And we were sort of interested in looking at, in this moment, as they're introducing the caps, and Miller is using this term backdoor quite often. If we look at this in a really contained way, what do we see? How can we sort of destabilize and find the edges of this narrative? We did historicize it a little bit more using policy archaeology, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But the other part of this that I think is relevant to us today is that to better understand how Miller was using this term backdoor, we turn to Carol Bacci's method of what is the problem represented to be. And probably many of you are familiar with this. Bacci's approach proposes that problems need to be constructed before policies can be enacted to quote unquote solve those problems, and that policy actors are often discursively trying to create or produce a prescriptive problem, a problem that needs to be solved so that they can create a policy to resolve it. And it seemed to us that this narrative of international students entering Canada through a back door was an example of the construction of a new problem. So I'll just talk about the history of this really, really quickly. If we can go to the next slide. So we looked at this, like Lisa mentioned, I'm a historian and maybe too much of a historian, but we looked at periods in the past where international students' presence in Canada had been delegitimized. And we did find that there were several of them, but they were very different than what we noticed was happening with Miller, because almost all of these periods, the question of legitimacy had originated in the mainstream media and maybe in popular conversation, what we might think of as almost anti-governmental or counter-governmental spaces where they were reflecting on debates with the state about how the state would intervene in policy regimes. Whereas, remarkably, what makes Miller so different is he was the Minister of Immigration when he was making these statements. So it was a person, he was the head of this department who was suggesting that there was something problematic about the policy regime as it existed. Lisa, if you go to the next slide, I'll show you. I can show everyone So we noticed that Miller used this specific phrase, a backdoor, 6 times in about a year. And 16 times may not sound like very many until you think about the fact that this means that many of the times that he was speaking about these issues in public, he was talking about this, including in one case when he had a pre-prepared statement that he delivered to Parliament about changing Canadian immigration policy. I wanted to pull out a couple of these quotes just to talk about them in more detail for a second, because I think they give you a sense of how, not only how frequently he was using this, but how over that year, the meaning of this sort of who is being blamed really evolved in quite concerning ways. So Lisa already read you this quote from January 22nd, 2024, when he said that it was important to, quote, make sure these institutions are actually what they say they are, not sort of fly-by-night operations and backdoor entries into Canada. But this speech was actually much more colorful, and I want to read you another quote from it that gives you a sense of who he was holding responsible for this. When he said, quote, "It is not the intention of this program," meaning the international student program, "to have sham commerce degrees or business degrees that are sitting on top of a massage parlor that someone doesn't even go to, and then they come into the province and drive an Uber," end quote. And so in this case, he's really quite colorfully and derogatorily talking about a particular kind of imagined private institution, this idea that there were a number of illegitimate institutions operating and that they had created this back door. But by September of 2024, so only about 9 months later, but by this point, the cap has been initially unveiled and the details of it are beginning to be rolled out. His description of this has changed quite a bit. So he says, quote, "It goes to the point I've been making to universities and colleges to make sure that their recruiting practices are better, that they make sure that the type of people that we are attracting under what should be a world-class student visa program is one where people don't turn around after they've paid all sorts of money to come here and claim asylum. This is a program that is aimed at international excellence and not a backdoor entry into Canada for whatever reason." And so now the narrative of who's using the back door has really changed, as has this, what has arrived is this conversation about the quality of students, the quality of international students themselves, instead of the quality of the institutions that are theoretically recruiting them. And so we could watch this backdoor rhetoric move, and in the process, really delegitimize the pathways, but also the students themselves that many international students, the pathways they used and the students themselves. Next slide, Lisa. Thank you. So this brought us to Carol Bacci's method, and looking at my time, I'm gonna just focus on a couple of these. Many of you probably know Bacci suggests a set of questions to use to unpack this sort of construction of the problem. So one of those questions is, of course, what is the problem represented to be in a specific policy or policy proposal? And what we noticed in this discussion was that Miller was sort of proposing that there were bad actors in the international student system that were undermining the integrity of the immigration system as a whole. Really importantly, we thought it was striking that he wasn't suggesting the policy was flawed. He was suggesting that people were taking advantage of it, that the changes had to happen not because of something the government had done wrong or because it had misunderstood, but because people had cheated in some way. Not even that they had broken the law, just they had violated the spirit of it. And that brought us, the second question, what presumptions or assumptions underpin this representation of the problem? We found that it was clear that Miller felt that elite institutions and students were appropriate as people, as the system, but that less elite institutions or possibly students from less wealthy countries, as Lisa was talking about with the arrival of so many students from South Asia, that this was problematizing, was somehow violating the spirit of the policy. The other thing that was really clear from this rhetoric is that Miller regarded post-secondary institutions as de facto bordering agents, that it was their job to police this to some extent. And so, Lisa, you can go to the discussion. So we took out of this, I think there was a lot, I think there is still more to think about, but I think there was a lot to think about in this. And Lisa sort of alluded to it earlier when we talked about the way that this rhetoric really impacts multi-step immigration policies. So, for example, we were really struck by the evidence that this was a devolution of bordering practices, that clearly the government had expected, the state had expected institutions, higher ed institutions, to do a better job of bordering, that the state regarded their failure to do that as a loss of control, and that that there was a disappointment, a frustration on the part of the government that there wasn't more like a more aligned values between institutions and the government. But we're also struck by this idea of the sort of shifting meaning of certain doors, where some doors had gone from being good doors or the right doors or front doors when they served, quote unquote, the right people. But as the people who passed through them changed, attitudes about those doors changed. And of course, this meant that the people who had used those entry points to Canada would find themselves re-subjected to bordering practices, their pathways gone from legitimate to illegitimate. Problematic enough in a one-step system, but in a three-step system like Canada operates for international students, this meant students would find themselves entering Canada perfectly legitimately, perfectly legally, as Lisa showed, with the encouragement of the federal government, only to now find that the door they'd come through was suddenly illegitimate, that the doors before them had changed or moved. And the metaphor we were really struck by was this idea of sort of a funhouse maze, where suddenly they enter a space that there are many doors, maybe some of which enter Canada, some of which are dead ends, some of which don't open at all, and students find themselves very, very precaritized by this change, delegitimized, and facing a rapidly changing bordering regime, without, even before the policies had themselves changed, just in the way that the legitimacy of those doorways had been reorganized. I think you can go. That's okay. Thank you. I was hurried, but thank you very much, everybody, for your time and attention. And I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to discussing this more too.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We will come back for there's so much to discuss about, but we'll come back to that. But now, Jane, it's your turn, your presentation.
Thank you. I'll go ahead to share my PowerPoint. Just a sec. Are we able to see this PowerPoint? Okay. Are we able to hear me okay? Great. Okay. Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Jinke. I am a PhD student from Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis Department, School of Education, University of Wisconsin-Madison, located in Madison City, Wisconsin State, United States. I'm so happy to be part of the panel today. And this is actually also my first time participating in this beautiful community. So very excited, very, very happy to be in the conversation with everybody and share my work. All right. Let's get started. So today I'm sharing my study, Constructing Conditional Rights, a comparative analysis of visa regime and institutional duties in the United States and Australia. I'll start by giving a quick heads up. What I did is that I compared the United States and Australia to ask a structural question. What kinds of rights international students have on paper, and how the visa rules shape those protection and rights, and who law and policy assign responsibility for them, is the government or the university. It is important to note that throughout this talk, I will use the word rights as an umbrella term for legal rights, entitlement, and privilege. And the punchline, which I'll unpack step by step, is that many protection and rights of international students are very conditional, meaning that international students' legal availability is always tied to visa status and compliance requirement, even on paper. To set the stage, let me talk about the broader environment. We all know that international student population is about 7 million globally, but this increase hides a deep structural problem. When students cross national borders, they leave behind legal rights and protection in their home country. And in host countries, their temporary student visa status often position them as legal outsiders. So here's the concept I want to put on table early, a legal vacuum. And just to be clear, I'm not only talking about the gap between two countries, I also mean the gap within host countries, between the logic of education governance as well as the logic of immigration control. And because of that, students can end up caught between two countries and between these two systems within the host country and not fully protected by either. Scholars have already documented the vulnerability of international students are experiencing in host country. They talk about housing and healthcare. They talk about labor exploitation. My argument is that these situations are actually connected to how rights and protection are legally structured under student visa governance. So how has existing research addressed this legal vacuum? The short answer from my literature review is not directly. The literature on international students is extensive now, but in the United States, it focuses heavily on sociological side, including student experiences like racial discrimination, cultural adaptation, and academic integration. Outside the United States, especially we have Australia and New Zealand, where scholars talk more about rights, but often through consumer protection framework or general human rights framework. Those approaches are very valuable, but they do not fully map the host country legal and policy mechanics. So the key gap I target is we kind of lack a map of legal and policy architecture, including what protection exists on paper and who the duty barrier assigned to be. With that gap in mind, here's what my study is trying to do. I examine how international students' right, entitlement, and privilege are defined and governed on paper in both Australia and the United States through three different angles: legal construction, governance mechanism, and institutional boundary. You might wonder why I use a comparative design when my primary research focus is in the United States. The reason I compare US with Australia, because I know Australia has a more explicit right-oriented legal framework for international students, and both countries I know are top destination that rely on student visa to govern mobility. In addition, this comparison helps separate structural feature of student visa governance from country-specific context. I feel like it will be helpful to clarify how protection gaps are built into governance design. Then my theoretic framework, I use claim right theory. And just as a quick reminder, I use rights as an umbrella term, which also include entitlement and privilege. But when I do the analysis, I focus on claim right because claim right are relational. Unlike liberty right, claim right exists only someone else has a corresponding duty to you. Following Finberg's, a right is a valid claim, which means in the rule system, you are authorized to demand that others fulfill the corresponding duty. I use it because this helped me to see who can make a claim on paper according to the legal and policy and who is expected to respond. Then my methodology. I used comparative document analysis. What I did is I systematically analyzed the legal and policy framework in both countries, and I used four source type, federal statutes, federal regulation, government agency, administrative system, as well as institutional policy. This classification is a bit complex because it spans two countries and four different sources. The table on the right is there to help visualize a little bit, but given the time, I won't walk through it in detail. I then apply an analytic framework with four domains: education, healthcare, housing, work, and due process. I developed these four codes by first using the pilot subset of document from both countries for open coding and memoing to identify recurring themes. And I also use three governance functions when I try to identify the duty barrier. I use oversight, enforcement, and redress, and I got this three from my theory, the claim right theory. Then let me turn to my first finding, two governance model. In Australia, it's a dual track system. Basically, two sets of rules operate at the same time. On the education track, the Education Service for Overseas Student Act, ESOS, treats students as consumer with clear consumer protection on paper. On the immigration track, university must monitor and report visa compliance, so university sitting competing dual role. They support student as service provider, but at the same time, they also function as an immigration monitor. The United States is a little bit different. It's more like a compliance-driven system. U.S. centered on immigration control and national security. Through the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System, CEVIS, the designated school official, DSO, act as a middleman for the government. They embedded visa management into campus process. So the many protections are procedural and very visa contingent. That means they operate only if a student maintain legal and lawful status. As a result, the university's primary institutional duty is compliance reporting. So it is essentially extends border control into the campus setting. Then let's compare how educational right and entitlement are governed in both countries. I found that in Australia, the right framing is more transparent. Student protection are not just guidelines, they are statutory entitlement clearly stated in the ESOS Act. That means the law linked the university duty, like the oversight and redress to student protection. But there's a catch. According to the national codes, universities are also have a duty to report visa compliance. So then the United States, there's no single student rights statute for international students in the United States. So the protection can be very, very scattered and they are mostly procedural. The system is a governance itself, managing an education pathway like course load, leave, transfer, all those things can become a compliance task on campus. And in the CEVIS, Student and Exchange Visitor Information System, so the power of DSO is very central. Many options depend on their decision and approval. At the same time, the risk can be higher. If a request is not processed correctly, the student can become out of status and may have to leave the country. Then let's connect this to the three everyday domain. First of all, healthcare and housing. In Australia, healthcare is organized. Students must purchase overseas student health cover, which works like a consumer style protection. And housing is mostly private market based. In the United States, healthcare is more fragmented. Coverage depends on school policy and private plan. Housing for students is also market driven, so protection can be very uneven. About the work, in Australia, labor protection exists. And in the United States, work is visa contingent as well. The right to work is more like a privilege. International students have CPT, which is curricular practical training, and OPT, optional practical training. So those are more like authorizations. Those require approval and documentation, and the DSO on campus function as a gatekeeper for government. The last one is due process. In Australia, complaints pathway exists on paper, and in the US, procedural option exists on as well, but the stake can be higher because if a service record is terminated, immigration consequences can be immediate. Through this comparison of Australia and the US, here's my discussion, and I'm mainly making 3 points. First, even with different legal architecture, these two systems make student protection depend on visa status. Both can create vulnerability. Second, the mechanism differs. In Australia, many protections are statutory entitlement under ESOS Act and National Code, including formal duty around information, complaints, tuition-related protection. The university are also legally required to monitor and report visa compliance. So the same institution is both a service provider and a compliance reporter, which can constrain redress in practice. In the US, governance is compliance driven. Many protections are very procedural and rules through DSO and campus. For example, reduce course load, program change, and work authorization. At the same time, domains like housing and healthcare are not codified at all. So responsibilities diffused across institution and private actor. This can create a responsibility vacuum as well. Third, international student protection are best understood as a conditional claim right. Extending Feinberg, a claim is only practical valid on paper when status is maintained and when duty barrier and redress pathway are clearly assigned. So what international students have are very conditional. It can only be called as a conditional claim rights. Then implication and recommendation. The implication is that we all know that international student risk are often overshadowed by visa risk, and scholars have found that it can, in practice, it can create chilling effect, and there is a risk that students stay silent about exploitation or unfair treatment because they fear they will lose their legal status. So based on that, I offer 3 recommendations to institutions. First, move beyond general handbook, provide visa status aware right training, teach students how to seek help without triggering compliance red lines. The second one is build independent support service that are separate from compliance reporting line. Make it clear to students that asking for help does not mean being reported. The third one is active responsibility. Do not stay hands-off totally in area like housing and healthcare. Maybe use some partnership with valid provider to offer stronger safeguard for international students. Finally, this study focused on law in the book, and my next step is law in action. So I plan to examine how these rules operate on campus and how international students navigate them. So that's what I have today. Thank you everybody for your attention. And I'll stop talking and I think I'm passing it to the next scholar.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant session. Looking forward to the further conversation. Ezgi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Arif.